Today, you will be with me in paradise. Paul speaks to the Corinthians, "For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, and not with eloquent wisdom, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power. For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. We preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles, but to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men." We have grown so used to the cross. We, who for 2,000 years in our Western culture have had the cross of Christ, reminding us that born not of only of the wisdom of the Greeks or the faith of the Jews, but born of the cross, our very civilization has come to be. We who have grown so used to the cross that it hangs as a piece of cultural detritus, a memory of time long past, in the National Assemblée Nationale, the National Assembly of Quebec, the crucifix of the Lord hanging over the speaker's chair in a place that passes godless laws, intolerant laws. The cross that hangs so much just as accoutrements, and how many houses, from how many ears, around how many necks. We miss how absolutely disgusting the cross was for the early church. How disgusting, despicable, and unimaginable the cross was for Jesus and his contemporaries, in which the Holy Spirit was to be born. And we will not understand the amazing revelation of the wisdom of God unless we pause and try and recapture that folly of the cross. The cross, the crucifix, it had absolutely nothing to do with religion in the imagination of Jew and Greek. The cross was the Roman manner of subjugation. It was the Roman way of showing to oppressed people who was in charge and what power they had. And it was built on, as so much of human ingenuity can be built upon, stretching out the suffering and pain, profoundly deepening the shame and horror and exploitation of the naked one nailed to the cross. Millions were crucified by the Romans. They crucified tens of thousands. We think of Spartacus's rebellion ending up with thousands of slaves crucified on the Via Appia. We think of the subjugation of Gaul, in which whole villages, men, women, and children, were just crucified and left to hang there. It was the way that you dealt with putting down people and asserting that life meant nothing except if you were a Roman in power. It was so outside of the imagination of anyone around that the cross could have anything to do with God. It cannot have anything to do with God, with religion, with anything. No one could see in this disgusting, subjecting, humiliating, shaming, painful reality. As a man or a woman or a child is nailed to the cross, the nerves of their hands splattered by nails, beaten up, hanging there desperately, on their feet nailed, or on a little piece of wood nailed, desperately balancing so that they could still breathe. Because the worst thing, the fear of every human being, the fear of Saint Thérèse of Lisieux as she was dying of consumption, was that she couldn't breathe. It's a horrible experience. And here, naked, struggling to keep their chest back so that they can breathe, for hours upon hours are left people just at eyesight, Jews who respect their bodies in such a way as to clothe them, left naked and humiliated. It was appalling. The very first image of the cross that we have in art is a bit of graffiti that was drawn by a Roman mocking someone he knew named Apuleius. And there's a picture over top of the words, Apuleius worshiping his god, of a man looking up at a crucified, donkey-headed figure. That's the first depiction in art of the cross. And the early believers, they struggled. They talked about the resurrection, but we know that they struggled to think that the cross would be anything of God. I've been, in my mind, trying to think of what would be a parallel for us. I know. How about this? That the symbol of God's love that you find hanging in a church would be the portal to a pornographic site. Click here if you're an adult and enter into this place. Can you imagine that being the place of God? That's what the cross was. Something unbelievable is happening. Only God could think that the crucifix, the cross, was to be the place of the fullest revelation of his love. Only God. If anyone argues about whether or not Christianity is invented by the wishful thinking of a few fishermen, no one could have come up with this. The early Christians didn't want to accept it. And yet, this is how God saves. Do we recognize it? Part of the cacophony of people around Jesus were these two men, probably compatriots of Barabbas's insurrection. The word in Greek for robbers was the Roman equivalent of terrorists, insurgents fighting against the power of Rome. Barabbas got up, but these two guys, they're getting crucified because the Romans want to show, here's what happens when you rebel. I can understand it when you are completely and utterly terrified of the agony that lies before you, that you just are all about yourself, and that you lash out and get angry. How many times visiting people in places of their suffering, in places of their dying, don't we meet them being angry? Huh? They have no choice. Their body is screaming out, "Pay attention to me." And so they lash out. I understand the two of them wanting to mock Jesus. Except one, he sees in an amazing moment of self-transcendence. He sees beyond his own suffering to the person that's there beside him. This too I meet more often than not when I go into the palliative care wards, when I visit people that are shut in, when I was in Uganda visiting those who are terribly, terribly poor, who should be all about and into themselves. They're able to park themselves and be attentive. I remember the beautiful face of Judy, who had a tumor the size of a watermelon on her face. And I know how painful it is to have a pimple, a zit, and to have this thing. And I would walk into her room and her first question would be, "Oh, Father, how are you?" That's what this man, this violent man next to Jesus, was able to do. I know you're innocent. We're getting what we deserve, but you're innocent. And Jesus says to him, Today, not down the road, not in some far future, not in some hopeful place that awaits, but this very day, you and I, you will be with me in paradise. There unfolding is the conversion that Jesus spoke about. The conversion of ignorance. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Giving way to the solidarity, the knowledge of the solidarity of suffering, the knowledge of the other that can come when suffering people are together. That is the opening in which Jesus on the cross, who even more than this thief is for us. Jesus, who on the cross, staring into the unbelievable abyss of humiliation, in this place of horror, is for us. And that all that he is going through, all that Jesus is suffering, is so that today we will be with him in paradise.